This is the UnShaw Podcast, the podcast about religion, atheism, and everything in between.
Welcome, dear listeners, to another episode of the UnShaw Podcast. Today we embark on a journey into the heart of Christianity's influence in the United States, guided by a guest whose insider perspective promises to be thought-provoking. From the corridors of power to the quiet corners of everyday life, the impact of Christianity reverberates around American society, shaping its culture, politics, and ethos. Our guest has just penned a compelling book called The Journey to Reason, chronicling his personal journey from a decidedly Christian upbringing to a profound reassessment of the beliefs that he argues are worryingly gaining traction within the US. So join us as we look at the complexities and contradictions in Christianity's role in shaping the American narrative through our guest and friend, Mark Alsip. Good morning, Mark.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've listened to your podcast for a long time now, since the first episode, and it is a great honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
The pleasure is mine, Mark. And just for the benefit of listeners, when I made the first episode of the podcast, I got in touch with a number of online atheists, and Mark was one of the people who gave the first episode a test run, and he's been a very staunch supporter of the podcast ever since. So I've got that to thank you for, Mark.
Oh, thank you for doing this. It's very valuable.
So we're going to be talking mainly about your book, which is published, is it April the 15th?
April the 15th is the release date, yes.
Yeah, and it's called The Journey to Reason. And we'll start off with your early life. So you had a Catholic mother, quite a staunch Catholic mother, is that correct?
Yes, very staunch. All the Catholics at that time were very adamant that anyone within that family be raised as Catholic, to the point where when she married my Protestant father, there was actually a wall or a fence put across the front of the church to prevent my not quite so Christian father from approaching the altar. And they had to go through a lot of, I'll say paperwork, but meetings and everything, just to guarantee that the child would be raised Catholic.
And you were born in Wisconsin, is that correct?
That is correct, Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
I'll level with you and say that my knowledge of the states is not what it should be, really. I don't know my Wisconsin from my Wyoming, but what I will say is that you then moved on to Kentucky.
Yes.
Now, Kentucky evokes for me evangelical Christianity and republicanism and Trump. Would that be a fair summary?
That is more than fair. We moved to the very southern part of Kentucky. We are dead center in the infamous Bible Belt. We are a very red state, to the point where when I go out to vote for the presidential election, I know that my vote will be cast away, because if you're familiar with our system, all the votes go to the winner, even though 55% of our state is Republican, and we have about a 45% independent and Democratic mix. They control about 90% of the legislature, so they are very fundamentalist. If your listeners are not familiar with young earth creationism, it is very much alive and well here. It's the doctrine that every word of the Bible is 100% true. You can't deny any part of the Bible, or you're denying the whole thing. The belief I was taught in church was a 6,000-year-old earth. Dinosaurs walked with humans. Earth was destroyed by a global flood. And I can't emphasize strongly enough how many people here actually really believe this as literal truth. It goes on to the point of interfering with government and church. Everything here is fundamentalist, which I'm sure we can dive into. But yes, the short answer to your question is we are extremely conservative here, except for perhaps the city centers.
Right. And you were baptized as a Catholic, but eventually, I think it seems from your book that the surrounding brand of Christianity, you and your family perhaps drifted towards that once you'd moved to Kentucky.
Yes, it's really interesting. The Catholic Church, of course, has the concept of original sin. So it was essential to have me baptized within a week of my birth. When we moved to the Bible Belt, the script completely flipped, and my evangelical church told me that I, as a Catholic, was not a Christian, and my mother was not a Christian, and they listed a lot of reasons, such as we weren't fully immersed in water, the Catholic Bible didn't have the right number of books in it, we were worshiping a pope instead of Jesus, we were praying to people other than Jesus, the saints and so forth. Yes, it completely flipped to my dad not being a Christian, to my mom not being a Christian, and both churches put pressure on me. But because I grew up here and went through most of my life here as a child, the influences of my Catholic upbringing and my mom being a Catholic, that being false Christianity, really tore at the core of me, because they literally told me, even after I was baptized into this faith, that my mother was going to burn in hell. And you talk about setting up a conflict for a young child. That one was front and center for a lot of my life.
Wow. And as well as being immersed in this type of Christianity and going to a school where I understand that you were taught young earth creationism as fact, you had a fascination with science at the same time, didn't you? And I read in your book about, what was it, making gunpowder or something similar?
Yes. A lot of the listeners may not remember a time when we didn't have the internet. And our internet, our World Wide Web, was a set of encyclopedias that my parents had. I was very curious about science. I don't know why people don't like science. I was turned on to it in school, and I just happened to be, bored one day. My mom said, "We'll go read the encyclopedia." And I found the story about the Chinese invention of gunpowder. And unfortunately for my parents and my community, they listed the ingredients. So I set about getting the ingredients for gunpowder, and I learned how to make it and succeeded to some extent. And we went on to World War I and chlorine gas. And unfortunately, once again, I learned how to make chlorine gas. My mom stopped me going to the kitchen and said, "Where are you going with those cleaning products?" And I went, "Oh, it's just a project, Mom." And I did succeed, and I did suffer from it. But the really cool thing was, my parents, instead of punishing me for this, of course they said, "Don't do it again," was a chemistry set showed up under the Christmas tree one morning. My curiosity, they encouraged it and tried to direct me in a more safe direction. But this did keep me on a path of verifiable results, empirical evidence, and everything I would learn through chemistry and science, not just the chemistry, but later on astronomy and so forth, conflicted with what my church would tell me. Everything that I learned through science, it seems like everything. I would go to church and they would tell me, "No, you're wrong and you're going to burn for believing in this." Long story short, I was very much into science, still love it to this day.
And did you not have any exposure to modern scientific thinking about the age of the Earth and so on at your school at this time, or was your school pushing the creationism agenda as well?
Well, the school, without really realizing it, would tell us that dinosaurs went extinct 65 million years ago, or that the speed of light was set, and we could look at stars and tell how far away they were, and we could kind of gauge the age of the Earth and the universe. But they didn't go into that because there was a lot of pressure from church. We still read the Bible every morning in secular school, even though the Supreme Court had struck down prayer, teachers who would invoke God during class. So I did get enough secular education to spur my interest and send me to the library and do more reading. And the reading I got there helped add to the little tidbits I picked up in school. For example, evolution is something that was just not talked about in grade school or even high school. It was talked about in my church, and they told me it was very sinful and it was derived from Satan. All that did was spur me to go to the library and find books on evolution or pull out the encyclopedias. So the hints were there in my secular education, but the teachers were afraid to say anything about Darwin, for example, except that he was this old man with a beard that went around and noted some differences in birds. And that's as far as they would go, because if they went further, they would get censured or even fired for speaking about this. So the church really was involved in the school back then, and I see that trend today. They're still trying to keep science out of schools.
One of your early questions was about rainbows and light refraction. Presumably, you were of the opinion that rainbows were created by God following, what was it, Noah's Ark?
Yeah.
And it was a sign of God's covenant and a sign that he wasn't going to flood the world again. But you knew different as a child. What happened?
Yes. So I was in a very, very early grade at school, and a teacher walked in with this little glass pyramid. And he called it a prism, and he walked over to the window and held it up to a beam of sunlight, and a rainbow appeared on the wall, and my jaw dropped. I was just in love with rainbows, and we got the best education you could give a young grade schooler. And when I say grade school, I know we have different school systems here across the pond, but I was maybe 8, 9 years old. So I got a pretty good introduction to the physics of light. But soon after that, I went to Sunday school, and we were studying, as you mentioned, Noah's flood. And the teacher told us that rainbows appeared after the flood as God's promise that he would never drown all these innocent babies and children and people again. And my hand shot up in the air immediately, and I was like, oh no. You've got this all wrong. Rainbows have existed ever since there was light and some medium to refract. And I talked about the raindrops, and she stopped me. The Sunday school teacher stopped me, and she was very angry. And she pointed at me, and she told the class, the whole class full of children, that Satan was speaking through Mark. And she warned me that I was going to be dragged to hell to burn forever if I didn't change my mind about something like this. And I went home, and I was very distraught. I was between 8 and 10 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, my dad, he said, I'll show you how to make rainbows. And we went out with a water hose, and this was a teaching moment. He taught me to wash cars as a chore as a result of this. But my parents would find me outside with a water hose many times after this, trying so hard to not get a rainbow because I wanted to believe what my church was telling me. I didn't want to burn in hell for believing in the physics of rainbow. So I would try to not make one, and I couldn't get it to work. And this was just the very first of many, many conflicts between science and church, but it was the most significant one. It's the one that sticks with me. I mean, every time I see a rainbow, I flash back to a teacher telling my class that I was going to burn in hell forever. To a child, that's very traumatic.
Well, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Your curiosity drove you to consume other scientific content, and I believe that Carl Sagan's Cosmos was very influential in your early life.
It was extremely influential. It debuted, I think, in the 17th year of my life, and it was on late night television for some reason. It was the first hint that I actually got of what evolution really was, because this wasn't taught in school. And Sagan was just such a genius at laying something out in simple terms that anyone could understand. And at the end of 1 hour of his show, I understood more about evolution than had ever been taught in school. And what was so significant about Carl Sagan is he never, ever came out and attacked religion or said that, oh, your religion is false, anything like that. You know, people talk about indoctrination, but science never indoctrinated me. Sagan just laid out facts for me that I could go out and investigate on my own. There were many other episodes. I'd mentioned in the book about being an amateur radio operator and doing experiments, listening to storms on Jupiter and, studying the speed of light. And he just opened up a new world for me that was not available to me until I finally got into a good secular college. And then things started opening up. But Carl Sagan really opened the doors for me, and I think for a lot of people.
And at university, you're presented with more knowledge about evolution, the age of the Earth, and so on. Well, prior to you going to university, are you still a practicing Christian, kind of struggling to reconcile church teachings with what you're learning through your scientific inquiry?
Very much so. Up until just before college, when I finally had a conflict with my father and said, I can't take this anymore, I counted it up through 600-something Sundays where I would go and learn that what I was learning in secular schools was sinful. And I would leave church every Sunday feeling like a failure, like I was disappointing God, because I was letting Satan speak to me by having me consider these alternative messages. I was living in two worlds, church world, and then I would push that to the back of my mind when I was out with my telescope, for example, or playing with the chemistry set or doing fossil hunting. I would push the church to the back of my mind, and then when I got to church, I would try to push the science to the back of my mind. And I'm not an expert psychiatrist, but Dr. Marlene Winnell, I think, she wrote a book called Leaving the Fold, and she talks about phenomena like this where you have these two conflicting realities and they butt heads, even subconsciously. I went to school, went to college, university, still very, very engrossed and in the clutches of this church. And yet it was forming a basis for a life based on rational thought. It was a very conflicted world.
So presumably you studied a scientific subject at university.
Yes, many. I was a computer science major and a math minor, but I was so in love with the natural sciences that I filled every elective I could with those sciences. But I did get a good introduction to biology and astronomy and geology in college. And geology, I believe, was the first course where my eyes really got opened up. Up until this point, I didn't really have the educational background to debunk the young Earth creationist view of a 6,000-year-old Earth. And that went away very quickly. In Geology 101, we learned, for example, radiometric dating. We learned about the geological history of the Earth. We learned very easy to debunk the claim of the Grand Canyon being formed by a global flood just by looking at how slow meandering streams form oxbows and the kind of force that would have been required to gouge out a 300-mile long, 1 mile wide, 1 mile high piece of rock.
Well,
and I also wondered, why did God hate that one piece of earth so bad that, he hit that with the whammy? So geology was a great introduction to debunking young Earth creationism and actually got me interested in writing about it. Another topic that set the rainbow story that we talked about earlier to rest was in astronomy. We would split the light of distant stars and looked at the spectra, the rainbow they produced, and look at absorption lines so we could see what the star was made of. But the key point there was I looked back and actually started laughing about the prism story I talked about earlier, because I was looking at rainbows that originated with light that came hundreds of millions or billions of years before. And for someone to tell me that rainbows didn't exist, college essentially gave me the ability to take on these people who were making pseudoscientific claims and beat them at their own game.
And another thing you talk about in the book whilst you're at university is when you're taking some medical courses.
Yes.
You're witnessing certain medical procedures such as open heart surgery and so on.
Uh-huh.
And that sort of highlighted the ridiculousness of thanking God when people
Yes.
get better. as opposed to recognizing sort of medical science's role in saving lives.
Yes, that was an epic moment in my life. As a pre-med student and having some good connections, I actually was invited to scrub in for surgery. So I wasn't watching like you see on TV through the glass windows. I was actually at the head of the operating table. My friend was an anesthesiologist, and she warned me, Mark, don't puke into the patient. If you're going to pass out backwards. Apparently, they had just had a medical resident pass out and fall the wrong direction, which really disrupts surgery. One of the patients clinically died. They could not get her heart started again, and it was a time of great panic. It took a long time, and it was a real struggle to bring her back. And after it was all over, I went to the recovery room, and I saw the joy in her family's eyes. I did see the physician slumped against a wall with his head in his hands because this was really close. We really lost that patient, and they brought her back. But the family was praising God. They were praising Jesus.
Oh.
And I know that the doctors and the nurses, our dedicated health professionals, aren't doing this for praise, but it hit me that had she not made it, the doctor would have been the first person who was blamed.
Yeah.
There would have been lawsuits, an incompetent doctor. Even if they had acknowledged the doctor, I've seen this so many times, Robert, where they'll say, oh, God was working through the doctor. I understand the emotional impact of having a loved one come through something that traumatic, but to give the credit to someone who was invisible and I never saw in the operating room, it just struck me as kind of strange, kind of disingenuous.
So your relationship with the church is fraught at this stage, although you carried on attending church through this time, I understand. Is this correct?
Well, I didn't regularly attend church. I would still go for major religious holidays. I was taking religious studies in college at this point and learning that there were other belief systems out there other than the one that I grew up in. And it really hit home that there was more than one way to view religion. And I try to point this out to everyone that my book is not really anti-religious. It's anti-fundamentalist. It's the fundamentalism that really causes problems. But I think at this point, I had already stopped believing in Christianity. There was just too much magic, too many miracles. One of the courses I took in college was actually Judaism.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So did you attend Judaism conversion classes with the intention of converting to Judaism? You learned Hebrew, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Now, if you put Hebrew in front of me now, the only prayer I still remember is the blessing over wine, which may indicate that I do enjoy a good drink now and then. But seriously, yes, I attended conversion classes in both a conservative and a Reform synagogue. The reason there was I saw, just like in Christianity, there were different denominations. I wanted to see what each side had to offer. And it was really my unwillingness to let go of religion. Religion taught me that I was nothing without Jesus and God. And I had already given up on Jesus, but I still wasn't ready to give up on God. And I thought, well, maybe Judaism would be the answer. So it was very enlightening. I learned a lot about biblical history, especially the Old Testament, including some parts of the Old Testament that Christians don't want to hear. It was very enlightening, but at the end, I was sitting there in synagogue on Shabbat one evening, and it hit me, I'm trying to prove to other people that I am worthy because I believe in God. And that's the same thing I was trying to do throughout my Christianity. I wasn't being honest with myself.
So this dabble in Judaism, it's almost like subconsciously you're thinking to yourself, being religious is good.
Yes.
And being an atheist is perhaps disrespectful, heathen.
Oh, we were taught in my evangelical church, atheism is equivalent to being a Satanist. There's no difference. There's no difference whatsoever.
Wow.
Reality is that atheism is just a lack of belief in gods. And to this day, Robert, I still feel funny. I feel a little uncomfortable calling myself an atheist because that is one of the scars that was left for me. As soon as that word comes up, there's an instant wall that goes up between me and all the fundamentalists, even the non-fundamentalists where I live. I have come out as part of the least trusted group in the United States. And yes, I'm an atheist, but there's no blood drinking or baby eating or anything like that. I believe in one less God than a Christian or a Muslim would.
Sure.
That's really all there is to it.
And one of my previous guests, we talked about the situation in America. We discussed a poll, I think it was before the 2020 election. There was a poll of Americans and 75% of them or something said that they wouldn't vote for an atheist president.
Yes.
So it's certainly got connotations that I don't think it really has elsewhere in the Western world, particularly in the Bible Belt, I'm sure.
Oh, it is, yes. And I think that's why, not to sway us too far into political grounds, but you can have a politician with very questionable morals, and that politician can just hold a Bible up, or right now sell a Bible, and I think we all know who I'm talking about. And that person is more trusted than perhaps an atheist, a good humanist who would really care about feeding people who are hungry, clothing people who need clothes, housing people that needs housing. It is required here, I would argue, that if you are not religious, you best not put your name on the ballot, because even the more liberal, more progressive politicians still have to profess their belief in Christianity. So it's a big problem here.
And I'm sure you'd agree with me that Trump's Christianity is somewhat inauthentic, I think.
Indeed. I mean, grabbing women by their genitalia is not a Christian value. I was taught exactly the opposite. I was taught incredibly in my church that women were not equal to men, but I was never taught that sexual assault of a woman was okay. And it absolutely boggles my mind that anyone could actually come out and say this and still have evangelical support. I can't wrap my brain around it. Can't.
I read an article very recently that the evangelical community in America is kind of losing a bit of faith in Trump. There's a big portion of them who are coming to the conclusion that perhaps this isn't our guy after all.
Yeah, they are out there. People in the GOP who are saying, wait a minute, we don't like where the party has gone. But Trump holds so much power right now that he has this hardcore evangelical base. And if you come out against him, a lot of people, not everyone, there has been some progress. Not every Trump candidate is winning in the polls, but I can promise you in my area that a Trump-supported candidate would at least win the nomination.
Well,
we have a very strong Democratic governor, but he is hampered by this legislature we have who are very open Trump, and they basically can override any veto he has. So Trump has a lot of power.
He was always going to get the Republican nomination if he put himself forward, wasn't he?
I guess everyone has a right to try, but, looking at some of the alternatives like DeSantis, who is requiring the teaching in Florida schools that slavery had benefits. He's a fundamentalist. I was taught in my secular school that slavery had benefits. I remember an 8th grade history teacher telling us who would pay that much money for something and then mistreat it. This happened in a secular school, and I see that being repeated now in Florida. And it got much worse in church. Church was just justification of racism and slavery. And when I say church, again, I'd like to remind the listeners that I'm talking about fundamentalist churches. I know there are many good people of many religions who don't buy into this, but I can't emphasize how strongly enough this still is a core belief of a lot of evangelicals. We're going backwards. We're going backwards.
Now, something as well you talk about it in the book is after leaving university and having some success in your career, the concept of divine punishment and the concept of hell is something that you really struggled with.
Yes, this actually originated at a very young age when I realized that I was going to go to heaven because I did give in to my church after a horrible movie. I don't know if we'll have time to talk about it, but a movie children should have never been sent to see.
We talked about that online, didn't we?
Yes.
It's called, what's it called? Thief in the Night, which basically scared a lot of young Americans at the time it came out because of its depictions of end times, which were frightening. Tell us about it.
Yes, so this film came to town, and we had exactly one theater in our small town, and all the churches in town encouraged children to go see this movie. This was back in the days when you could take a child, 12 or 13, and send them loose in the town center without any parental supervision. So this was a whole theater full of young children. I was maybe 13 or 14 years old, and the imagery, there were people on fire, burning with their skin peeling off, reaching towards the screen, moaning and begging for us in the audience to save them and telling us how sorry they were. There was a woman, the whore of Babylon, who was drinking human Christian blood, and it was dribbling down her lips. These may not sound traumatic to listeners today who are used to seeing a lot more blood and gore on TV, but this was the 1970s. This was the age when people who were shot in a movie clutched their chest and fell over. There was no blood, end of story. Children around me, Robert, were crying. People all over the audience, you could hear people crying and sobbing. I was curled up in my seat in terror. And the impact would stay with me forever. It would convince me to get baptized. But before I did, one of the most interesting things about it were the angels blowing the horns to signify the rapture. I lived near an interstate, coincidentally, and I would go to bed at night, and I would hear what you call a lorry, we call trucks, blow their horn, and I would wake up screaming. This is the effect that this had on small children. So yes, right after that, I rushed out and got baptized because I didn't want to be there. But to segue back now to where we were earlier, I realized that I was going to heaven, but my mother was not going to because she was Catholic. And I went to the elders in my church with this problem. Hey, my mom is not going to go to heaven with me. I don't want to go to heaven without my mom. And they said, well, your job now, you're sent by God to convert her. It's your mission in life. That is your number one thing to do. And I tried so hard. I was so biblically literate that I was actually giving sermons to my church at one point. And my mom would attend because she attended every child event. And when the altar call came, she didn't come up. And I would go home at night and cry myself to sleep because I failed my mom. I failed Jesus. I failed God. And the nightmares actually increased after I got baptized because I can still, it's hard not to get emotional right now. I remember the nightmare so vividly of me being on a cloud and looking down and seeing my mother, who by any definition is a saint, and she was on fire, and she was reaching up to me, begging me to help her, reminding me of how good she had been to me. And I would go to this blinding white light that was God and say, please, she's a good person, let her in. And he would say, no, she made her choice. So finally, to flash forward to where we were earlier, in my later religious studies as an adult, it just hit me that if God is omniscient, I'll get the word out here, and he knows that I'm going to make this choice as an atheist, or my mom was going to make her choice, and he created me anyway, and he created hell anyway, so he knew that I was going to go to hell. And I posed this to a priest who taught our religious studies class in college, and unfortunately, it stumped him. It stumps every Christian that I talk to about it, that billions of people are going to burn in hell while others are going to be happy in heaven. My morality won't allow that. And the priest gave me the answer the church always gave me. Mark, you need to go away and pray on this, and you'll get your answer. And the answer has never come. The answer's never come.
And I think it's one of the unattractive aspects of Christianity, that it's almost like a set of beliefs gets you to heaven, as opposed to the things that you do whilst you're here.
Yes.
God will send you to hell for not having the right beliefs, but then do nothing to foster this belief.
Exactly. Yeah, I often ask people, or I have people who try to convert me still, they tell me without God, without religion, that they would be rapists or drug addicts, they wouldn't work, they would cheat on their wives, they wouldn't provide for the family. And my question to them, is that the only reason you're a good person? Is that all you got? I don't do good works. And I stress, my wife is a Christian. I have many loved ones who are in religion who do good works because they want to do good works. They don't expect a reward, and they're not doing things out of fear of punishment. And to me, if I'm going to take something positive from religion or even atheism, that's what I'm looking for. Why are you out there doing good things? Do good things because they're good things, not because you're going to be burned or you're going to get a cloud in heaven. That seems like really an obvious thing to me. The fundamentalists I engage with all the time are telling me it doesn't matter the good works that I do. I'm lost. So it's a good thing I don't believe in hell, I guess.
And that injustice about divine punishment and the concept of hell and so on, would you say that was the sucker punch for your belief? Was that the thing that sort of tipped you over into thinking there isn't a God?
Yes, that would be the final blow. It was led up to, of course, by reading the Bible cover to cover many times. So the foundation of doubt was there, but I cannot, in my wildest dreams, imagine a loving Father who, Christians say God is our Father. I can't imagine anyone being tortured like that. So that was the absolute death blow for me as far as religion is concerned.
And today you have a Facebook page, which is extremely well followed, which is called Bad Science Debunked. Is that right?
That is correct.
And you have over 12,000 followers.
Yes.
Are you identifying scientific problems with religious beliefs specifically, or is it everything pseudo-scientific?
It started out as everything pseudoscientific back around 2015 when people were against genetically modified organisms. The only thing you should eat, and you shouldn't have chemicals. And I was pointing out, hey, folks, everything is made of chemicals. Everything you eat and drink. Religious conflicts with science started to creep into the blog. Early on, I started debunking the Ark encounter, which is just about an hour up the road from me. And as time went on, the blog became more and more about the conflict between religion and science. It's almost exclusively that now. Probably in the long run, I'm branching off with an author page where I'll go more of the debunking of the religious items and maybe leave the science blog. I haven't decided yet, but most of my follower base is still on that Bad Science Debunk page. And I find that my message still resonates with a lot of people there because they'll write me and say, yeah, I went through this too. I was taught that the earth was destroyed by a flood. So it's been a fun page to run, but we'll see how that goes.
You share the posts of the organization Answers in Genesis.
Yes.
Quite a bit, which is one of the big sorts of pressure groups. It calls itself an educational institution, which is questionable. But Answers in Genesis, you're very much involved in debunking what they come out with. Now, do you think those guys secretly believe that young Earth creationism is nonsense? Do you think they really believe in 6,000 years and humans being created in the same form that they are now?
That is an excellent question, and it is one that I don't think I've been asked before. I have my suspicions that some of them are in this because it's bringing in a lot of money, but having been indoctrinated as I was, I could see myself actually being a scientist at Answers in Genesis, or there's another one, the Institute for Creation Research. I could actually see myself being one of their scientists and signing the creed that they all signed that says, I will deny any scientific evidence that disagrees with the 6,000-year-old Earth. So I would say that some of them actually do believe this. There are creationists like Hugh Miller or Steve Austin who have been out there for decades trying to disprove an old Earth. And I think they actually believe, I do believe that they're into this. They're convinced.
And you said that you live quite near to the Ark encounter as
Yes.
well, which I understand public money helped to build. Is that right?
That is correct. They got, first of all, tax exemptions from the state, even though they were a strictly religious foundation. So they got their tax breaks. They got the state funding to do a completely new infrastructure for the on-ramps and off-ramps and, all the road improvements and everything that would go along with it. And it goes beyond that. They have begun reaching out to schools who will send students there on the pretense that this is a family organization, that it's not a religious organization. My first writing break actually came from the National Center for Science Education. They wanted the viewpoint of someone who had been through this and what were their impressions of going to the Ark encounter. And the thing that struck me, the reason for my book, was seeing all these children who were going around being indoctrinated. And very interestingly, it's not just state funds that went to them. It's that state funds, scholarship funds for one college I called out in particular, were sending their students there on field trips using scholarship money. And it gets worse. Now we have before the voters in November, it's called House Bill 2, where we're going to vote to rescind part of our Constitution and allow state funding of private religious education. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Answers in Genesis has just purchased about $30 million worth of buildings, and they're converting them into classrooms. I think that they're setting all this up. They're going to benefit from this. And the taxpayers, I will be forced, if this passes, I will be forced to send someone to a school that teaches Answers in Genesis curricula.
Wow.
It's amazing. It's amazing. It's very terrifying.
And it's almost surreal. I mean, I've never visited the United States, and one day I'm sure that I will. But for me, living in England all of my life, the whole influence that this particular brand of Christianity has in certain parts of America,
Yeah.
it's surreal. It really is.
Yeah. I have been fortunate enough to travel to, think about 45 countries in my life, and almost everywhere I go, people look at me and ask me, do Americans really believe this stuff?
Yeah.
And I can assure you they do. It's not that people outside the United States are incredulous about this. There are still a lot of Americans, I think, who haven't woken up to the fact that this is a danger here. Even after, like, our Supreme Court got loaded with conservative religious judges, people are still missing the fact how dangerous this is, and they don't seem alarmed. We are an 80% religious country, and they can't seem to differentiate between letting everyone believe what they want to believe and the more fundamentalist approach of, you must believe exactly what I believe.
Yeah.
So this is very clear and present danger.
And I'm going to invoke the old cliche that everyone has a book in them. And this book, in lots of detail, charters your journey from being brought up in a very conservative, fundamentalist, evangelical community and being introduced to science at school and at university. And is your journey a common one? Do you meet many people who have had the same upbringing as you, ending up getting an education and then thinking to themselves, what I believed for the first 20 odd years of my life has proved to be nonsense?
I do. Actually, I do. It's very interesting that you asked that question. I just returned yesterday from my first ever American Atheist Conference in Philadelphia and had a chance to do some roundtable discussions with other people. And several people had experiences almost identical to mine, where just as I realized when I was young, hey, this doesn't make sense in the Bible, I'm done with this. So there's kind of a spectrum of people, if you will, the fully indoctrinated people like me, up to the people who never were involved in religion. But yes, what I've gone through is very common. And unfortunately, where I live, the type of education that brought me out of this seems to be on the decline. It's under attack right now, and that scares me very much.
Yeah.
This may sound arrogant, and I do not mean it to be. The more education you have, the more liable you are to stray away from this. Now, I do know many very educated people who still manage to hold on to religion, but what I find is that they are more spiritual. They don't have this dogmatic approach. They're fine with evolution. They're fine with the age of the earth. I think it's an unnecessary battle that Answers in Genesis has really put forward. I often tell people, had I not been presented with all that dogma, I may have gotten all the way through my education and still remained a Christian. But because I could see clearly, even as a child, through my education, by 6th or 7th grade, I was already pointing out flaws that Sunday school teachers could not answer. I just couldn't stay with it anymore. So I think that the fundamentalists are kind of maybe shooting themselves in their foot, and their only way out of this is to eliminate secular education.
I did speak to one of my guests about the situation in America, and he seemed to be saying that he thought that America was becoming more secular generally. But from your perspective, it seems like there's these pockets in America where evangelical Christianity is flexing its muscles and perhaps even undergoing a little bit of a resurgence.
Yes, I am pretty sure I remember the episode that you're talking about, and I would respectfully disagree with the notion that we're becoming more secular. And for evidence of that, I would again point to what happened with our Supreme Court. The 3 judges who were appointed were all Federal Society, either members or sponsored, which is a very fundamentalist, strict organization. We've passed, I think there were over 400 anti-LGBTQ laws across the country recently. And when Roe v. Wade was overturned, the map of states where women could go for reproductive health care, just based on religious beliefs, I think it was like 22, 25 states that had trigger laws in effect. In schools that I'm familiar with, the book bans and the forbidden topics, they seem to be under attack everywhere. And maybe I'm a little more sensitive to it because I lived through it. My call to action here is that I think there's more to this. I think it's worse than some people think it is. And I think that's reflected by what we see going on in government right now.
Interesting. Well, Mark, thank you for coming on the UnShaw Podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you for your insights on the complexities of Christianity's influence in the US. I'm sure my listeners have learned something from hearing your answers. On the UnShaw Podcast, I aim to inform our listeners' perspectives on a number of things. So thank you for furthering the understanding of my listeners.
Oh, thank you for doing this. It's very valuable.
As we reach the end of another enlightening episode of the UnShaw Podcast, we extend our heartfelt gratitude to Mark for sharing his invaluable insights into Christianity's influence in the United States. If you're intrigued by Mark's story and eager to dive deeper into the themes discussed today, you can find more details about his book at unshawpodcast.com/books. To all my listeners, thank you for tuning in again this Sunday. Remember, the journey of understanding is ongoing, and I'm grateful to have you along for the ride. As we bid farewell, let's carry the spirit of inquiry and empathy into the week ahead. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep shining your light. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and keep exploring. This is UnShaw, signing off.